In this video, I'm going to talk about common setup problems based on ball position and swing faults that are derived from having the ball in the wrong position, and how to simply make these changes to not only hit the ball more cleanly and more crisply and get a better launch angle, but in the second part of the video, I'm going to talk about how it's going to help you pick up more club head speed. So first, what I want to talk about is the #1 flaw that we see in all the lessons I've ever given, thousands and thousands of lessons. Hands down, the most common fault that we see at setup with the ball position is having it too far back in your stance. This happens out of the subconscious fear to make sure that we can make the contact. If you hit a couple fat ones, you start moving the ball further and further back, and then what you end up is in this never-ending cycle that as you hit a fat shot, you move the ball further back in your stance. It makes your swing faults worse. You shift your weight less, because if you shifted your weight properly, you'd top the ball, and your divot would start out of here. You'd miss the ball completely. So what happens is you start all of a sudden, making these changes because you're hitting the ball fat and trying to fix the wrong thing. Moving the ball position up in your stance is actually the solution when you're hitting the ball fat a lot of times. Not all the time, but in most amateur golfer cases, when they start moving the ball further and further back, they start hanging further off their right leg, start doing this kind of motion, and then it just leads into a million faults that you can't fix without getting your weight shift corrected. You can't fix your weight shift without having the ball in the correct position, because as I said earlier, you'd literally completely miss the ball. So the #1 thing that you need to check, and you need to do this daily, every time you go to the range, throw a shaft down and then throw another shaft down so you can see where the ball is at in your setup. And if the ball looks like this, when you're set up parallel, perpendicular to another shaft going down the target line, it's too far back in your stance, and you're going to have all kinds of issues with your swing, because weight shift is one of the most important fundamentals in your swing. You have to have it for power and consistency. And so when the ball is this far back in your stance, you're going to have to hit it off your back foot, which is going to lead to a multitude of problems. Okay, so #1 problem, just make sure the ball is up off the logo of your shirt, off the left side of your left ear, for right-handed golfers, of course. And now you'll be able to turn back behind it, and as you shift forward, you won't be getting out in front of it. You'll be shifting back to the ball, and then you can make good contact and release the club. So that's #1 problem. #2, and this is a different one that you probably haven't heard before. I want to talk about how from down the line, having the ball at the right distance actually helps you pick up club head speed. So let's look at this fault. #1 fault that we see kind of goes back to the first one, where the ball's too far back in your stance because you hit a couple fat shots, you're not hitting it solid. Instinctively, our minds say, put the ball back in our stance. Well, what the second thing that you're going to tend to do is set up really close to the ball, because again, we have the subconscious fear that the further that we are from the ball, the harder it's going to be to hit. So we want to get really close to the ball, and what this is going to tend to do is make us have a really steep swing plane and a really steep angle of attack. You can pull that off with your wedges, but when you get to your 5-6 iron, your 4 iron, your 3 iron, your 3-wood off the deck, and you can't get enough height on it, the trick, apart from making sure the ball is up in your stance properly, is making sure that you are set up far enough away from the ball that it won't steepen your angle of attack. Because what's going to happen here, I'm going to really exaggerate this for a moment to make this point very clear. If I stood really far away from the ball, and this is a 7 iron, so exaggeratedly far from the ball, I'd have a really hard time hitting down on it very steeply, compared to if I stood really close to the ball, I can get a really steep angle of attack and dig a big trench here. So as I start moving the ball further away from my stance, what it's going to allow me to do is release the club properly, but it's more importantly going to help me pick up speed. Why does it help you pick up speed? The reason is, the longer I can effectively make this club, the shaft, the faster it's going to move. For every ½ inch that you go up in a club, so for instance, all of your irons tend to be a ½ inch longer than the next. So your 7 irons a ½ inch longer than your 8 iron. The reason for that is it helps you pick up about 2 miles an hour club head speed for every ½ inch that you go up. So effectively, when you set up really close to the ball, you've taken that golf club and you've made it really short. Kind of like what I talked about in the VJ video, where I'm talking about using the pinky, and instead of trying to push with your right hand and make the club work around this point, we're letting it work around this point. We're effectively making that club longer. Well, the same is true, of course, in your setup. So if I set up really close to the ball and I come into impact, the radius of my swing is going to be very narrow versus here. Now I've just turned my 7-iron into a 4-iron. So as I get a proper setup and distance from the ball, now I have a lot longer effective club. It's going to help you pick up a tremendous amount of speed with no more effort on your part. It's just proper fundamentals. So how far do we set up from the ball? Well, we cover that in all the setup videos, right? So don't need to worry about that here, but just make certain that you're not setting up the ball too far back in your stance and too close to the ball, especially if you struggle picking up speed with the longer clubs and getting the ball up in the air. With a 3-iron, this is going to make the club move faster, and it's going to shallow out your angle of attack because your swing plane can't be so steep compared to when you're setting up close to the ball. And it's going to allow the club to come in shallower, clip the ball off the turf, get the ball up in the air, and you can start hitting those long irons again. So those two things are the two most common swing faults that we see with the bad ball position. Make sure the ball's in the right spot and good things will happen in your swing.